Welcome back, Tennessee Valley, this morning. WTMB Joe and Kim Palo, and we are now joined by Dr. Subroto Kundu, who's a neurologist here in town. And Dr. Kundu is going to talk to us today about seizures and epilepsy, which affects, well, I guess, how many Americans is it affect?
Oh, it's about roughly 1% of the population.
Really?
Yes, 1 in 100.
Wow. Wow.
It has a higher incidence in the childhood, infancy and childhood range, and then through adult life, there is a little down curve, and then again the incidence starts rising above 60s.
What I have heard in the past is that you can have epilepsy, but you can also, for lack of a better word, acquire epilepsy, like maybe a blow to the head.
Right, from either
falling down or a strong blow to the head can trigger it.
Of course, you know, the majority of seizures, you know, first of all, you have to clarify that certain words that are used around and people mean different things by it.
Right.
So the word epilepsy sometimes has a very negative connotation, and people say that, oh, I have a seizure, but I don't have epilepsy. So you have to clarify that.
Right.
That the epilepsy is a state of having repeated seizures.
Right.
Where a seizure is an individual event.
Okay.
So there's the same difference between a battle and a war. So you have many battles in a war.
Right.
So to come back to what you're saying is that the cause of epilepsy intrinsically is a focus in the brain that causes abnormal electrical discharges, and that is the pathophysiologic basis of epilepsy. That means that is the root cause. Now, why one part of the brain suddenly becomes electrically active can be legion. The thing is that you can have a small scar which may have been part of birth trauma, and that is actually the commonest cause. If you have a small tumor growing, then obviously that's not something you're born with, but at whichever point in time, that could be as a child, it could be as an adult, it could be an elderly person. If you have a small stroke, that could be the same thing. And to come back to what you're saying, certainly a trauma is also an area where there's a damage done to the brain. So that damage done to the brain, whether it becomes electrically active or not, we don't know exactly what triggers it, but certain sets of circumstances does make it electrically active, and you have a state of seizures.
And there's different kinds. We all, you know, I know that when most people think about a seizure, or when I always have, it's always been the shaking and the, you know, and I know that there is the myth about you need to put a stick or something in the mouth because you're going to swallow your tongue. That's not possible. That's not really what happens. But there are different types of seizures. Some that you wouldn't even hardly recognize, that just is maybe staring off, and is that also with epilepsy, or is it, or is that, you know, is that a type or a form? Are there different types of you know, I'm not really sure. I know there's different types of seizures. So do they go with different types of injuries that happen, or infection, or whatever?
Well, there again, you know, you have to separate the terminology, and that is what will clarify the whole thing. If you define a seizure as an abnormal electrical discharge in the brain, then it becomes much easier to understand. Right. So now the abnormal electrical discharge in the brain may manifest in various ways. If the electrical discharge is, let us say, close to the left front part of the brain, which has control of motor activity in the opposite side of the body, so you could conceivably get something like that, which is a jerking movement, which would be called a focal motor seizure.
Okay.
Now, if that focus moves a little backwards where there is no motor equivalent, then that individual would feel something abnormal passing up the arm, or some abnormal
But there
sensation,
wouldn't be any jerking.
But there wouldn't be any jerking.
Oh, okay.
On the other hand, if it goes right to the back of the head where it's involved with vision, then somebody can see very bizarre lights, things like that. And then if it goes to other part of the brain where primarily is involved in consciousness, then you would get alteration of consciousness. So somebody who is attentive and focused on you then goes blank. Now, all of these are seizures. Right. So you have to separate what we are calling seizure by our definition, which is the so-called, I don't want to use the word pathophysiologic because I don't know what it means to common people, but what actually is the background occurrence that causes this episode, and then the outward manifestation.
Okay.
So if you keep these two separate, it becomes very easy to understand that if you take the outward manifestation of seizures, now you could say that somebody is having what is a generalized tonic-clonic seizures. Why does that happen? Because the electrical activity from one area spreads all over the brain. And lo and behold, all the muscles are active at the same time while the person passes out.
Okay.
Right.
So that is a typical generalized seizures which may begin at one point. And that beginning at that point will manifest upon where that point is. Let us say that the point is deep in the temporal lobes. And in the deep in the temporal lobe, that person suddenly would feel a weird sensation, which we call an aura. Now, people who are epileptics recognize it, that this is going to lead to something pretty bad. And they can sometimes protect themselves by getting into a safe position just because they recognize that this aura precedes the spread of discharges. Right. So let us separate out what is happening electrically in the brain, which we can see, which is a theory, which we can prove experimentally, but what a common person standing outside cannot see, that their brain is electrically active. Right. But what they see, that this person suddenly freezes or may do something very stereotyped. They may smack their lips and they may like move their hands, and what you recognize the fact that this person now is in an altered state. That means the brain has been taken over by an abnormal electrical focus. And that is the manifestation, which then goes on to have the electrical activity go all over, and this person then loses consciousness. So while that person may be standing, they will fall down.
Okay.
If they are sitting, they may slump down. If they are lying, of course, that is a protected situation right away. But you could see that the person falls and falls in a most bizarre fashion. They could fall completely face forward, they could fall backwards, and as they fall, then there is the whole body goes into a spasm, because now the muscles contract all over. Now, in any movement, you have an agonist which pulls the muscle in one direction, and similarly, there's an antagonist pulls in the other. And whenever in the body you have a movement, then the agonist and antagonist are working opposite. That means if when the arm pulls, these sides relax. In seizures, obviously, everything is active. Both are pulled at the same time, so you would find that the person is stiff completely, and all the body is rigid, and that is called a tonic phase.
Okay.
The tonic phase obviously cannot last forever. When it gives way, then you can have the jerking, because one part is giving way while the other is still contracted. And that goes from the tonic to the clonic. So there is a tonic-clonic phase, and the person will convulse. At the same time, the jaws will clench down. And to point out what you just said about putting something in the mouth, I'm glad that we have a platform like this for once and for all to tell you never put anything in the mouth. I mean, whoever started this or however this kind of lore got around, is one of the most damaging things to happen, because the common sense is that it is not that you're going to choke on your tongue. We don't. Our air paths are open. What can happen is the person bites down on the tongue, and there is very little way of preventing that. Right. Very little way, because if you put anything in the mouth, then the jaws clamp down on that object. Now, if sometimes you have a soft element, even a rolled up towel if somebody has, it is possible to get that in, but the jaws shut so tightly that anything you put over there can get cut. And I have had situations where people put their fingers in and the fingers get bitten off. So, and if you put a spoon in, I don't know who came up with that idea, but there seems to be these prevalent ideas in the community, and that is a real no-no, because that really damages, and people break their teeth because of that. Now, here's the good news, is that doesn't matter how bad a tongue bite is, the tongue is a very vascular organ, and it heals right away, believe it or not.
It bleeds like there's no tomorrow, but it heals very quickly. It heals,
so there are a lot of things to understand about this seizure as it's happening in front of you, that it is a very, very scary thing to happen. Good news, it's rarely fatal. unless somebody falls and really hits the head and something like that. So the damage is due to the circumstances around you. If you fell down in front of a fire, obviously that would happen. If you fell down from a height, or if you were in water, this is what constitutes seizure precaution, that at that point when this happens, the person is not in control of himself or herself, and the people around them should see to it that they are protected.
Right.
But the seizure itself is self-resolving in a matter of seconds.
You're right.
It rarely is a minute. So a typical generalized tonic-clonic seizure, which we also call grand mal seizures. The word grand mal goes back to the last century of the one before that, actually. And it's a French word that means big bad seizure. And that was separated from petit mal, which means small bad seizure. In a petit mal, you have a blank staring spell, typically in a child, so that somebody who is attentive and then suddenly blanks out for a moment and comes right back into the conversation. That's a very typical petit mal seizure. It is associated with a very, very typical pattern of electrical discharge in the EEG, but obviously that is of no relevance to a layperson, only to a neurologist. But we separate these types depending on the outward manifestation. And once we separate these two thought processes, that what exactly constitutes a seizure, then we look for the various manifestations. Now we are able to make a mental picture of how we use these terms. You know, what is a grand mal seizure? What is a petit mal seizure? What is a tonic-clonic seizure? What is an absence seizure? Absence is about the same thing as a petit mal. And then there are these manifestations of abnormal behaviors, which can be very brief, very stereotyped. I actually have a publication on whistling epilepsy, where that person just suddenly starts to whistle. And I have that on videotape. And because seizure monitoring is important, so when you go into the study of seizures, what is actually done is that the outward manifestation of an individual is videotaped. And at the same time, the electrical recording from the brain goes on half of the screen. Now you really have the tool to study both the background brain physiology, and this is the basis of seizure monitoring. So hospitals and other units where you have to study seizure, this is what we do. We record the brain waves, and we actually see what this individual does simultaneously. Now you are really set to be able to characterize what exactly constitutes a seizure and recognize in that individual that what abnormal behavior, like you said, that somebody is talking and they blank out for a moment and come right back in the conversation. Did that happen because they remembered that they left the oven on? It can happen. So you know, you're distracted because something hit you, and you went back, and it seemed like you didn't continue to participate in the conversation, whether it was an internal thought process of this individual that caused them to be distracted momentarily versus an abnormal electrical discharge. How would you know that? You can only know if you were recording the brain waves at that time, and therefore this tool of seizure monitoring comes up, and that is the basis of analysis of where in the brain that seizure focus comes from. Then we have wonderful tools to locate that area and identify it right on the site or inside the brain, and then you take the imaging study, for example, an MRI, which is a three-dimensional image of the brain. You can place that focus right in one area. Once you do that and you show that this is the only area the seizure is coming from, now you are truly set to be able to go and take that out. And that is the basis of epilepsy surgery, because that is curative for the most part.
Well, let me ask you this. So basically, people that have seizures, whatever the seizure may be, that doesn't always mean they're epileptic. It means that they could be having a seizure that's related to some other issue of the brain not firing correctly.
Well, again,
or is it all
just
under
a matter
epilepsy?
of terminology.
Okay.
See, if you just go back and go over what you just said, that if somebody has repeated seizures, we would have to say that that person is epileptic.
Okay. But
now, why that person is having a seizure
is the other
is different. So now you can, is it from a scar? Is it from a vascular malformation? Is it from a tumor? Then the treatment will vary depending on that.
Right. I was at a public store several years ago, and there was a little girl in there with her mother, and she had a very high fever, and she went into a seizure. You know, and everybody kind of panicked around it. But then it was like there was another lady that had been there and said, "No, this is very common with a high fever. This, you know, she's, you know," and everybody just, you know, gave her room, and the lady was very calm and had everybody, because no one knew, and then got her to the hospital. But that's just a typical of an isolated incident with infection.
I'm glad you brought it up, because we had just been talking about an area of the brain which is electrically active. That means there is a structural, the assumption is that there is a structural point in the brain which is to blame. Now, the situation that you have presented is different, that the structure of the brain is fine, but something is happening in the environment of the brain that causes it to be electrically active. Now, what happens in febrile seizures, we don't know very well. It may well be that there is a focus somewhere. We haven't really figured it out, but particularly children in conditions where they have a high fever, they are prone to have this abnormal electrical activity. But by the same token, there are a large number of other things that can go wrong with the environment in the, that the brain is bathed in. For example, alcohol. So if somebody drinks alcohol on a regular basis and they were to stop, then they go through what's called an alcohol withdrawal seizure, which is one of the commonest presentations. The assumption is that there is nothing wrong with the brain, but you're giving the brain the wrong kind of environment to be in, and lo and behold, it reacts in abnormal fashion. The same is true from drugs. The same is true from situations where your body metabolism is upset. There are certain elements in the blood, for example, calcium, magnesium, and sodium. If for whatever reason the levels of these drop, then the brain becomes very electrically active. So these are such examples where nothing is structurally wrong with the brain, and you cannot localize one point in the brain where that electrical activity is coming. The chances are it is generated all over. This mechanism, why it exactly happens, we do not know, but we know that certain things drop the so-called seizure threshold, and the brain is much more prone to having this electrical activity.
Well, Dr. Kundu, I know we're getting close to running out of time here today. We do appreciate you coming by and talking to us the third Wednesday of every month. And it's always interesting to hear things, because I think the brain, most people, we know nothing about it. I mean, most people kind of have an idea about certain things.
He knows a lot about it.
Well, he does. Right. We don't know anything about it.
All I'm saying that it
We've got one, kind of. Maybe one between
us,
the two of us.
we got one,
Between the two of us, we got one.
Well, it took me about 20 years to learn it, and then another 22 years to get to learn it better. So that's where I am today. And if you are willing to put in that time, you'll know all about it.
Right.
But till then, you know, we kind of exchange ideas to know it a little better.
And it's Dr. Kundu is a wealth of information on neurology and, of course, brain activity. And if you have any issues that you've been experiencing and you don't know exactly what to do, I suggest you give Dr. Kundu a call. Maybe go by his office and let him check you out and determine what may be your situation.
Well, you could be like me. I'm not going to rush Joe over there this afternoon.
No. But Dr. Kundu,
I've dealt with this for a long time.
If you will, tell us where you're located and your phone number if somebody does want to get in touch with you or make an appointment.
My office is, in fact, next to the Skyridge Hospital, the professional building just to the left of it. It's on Chambliss Avenue. And my telephone number is 790-1529.
Okay.
And obviously, you know, the usual listings for neurology, you can also find me.
Okay. And I'll tell you what, folks, again, he can help your situation out. And those of you that are experiencing, don't wait, because waiting could be more of a problem for you than if you go immediately and get it taken care of. And of course, he can tell you if you have any issues. So go by and see Dr. Kundu. Dr. Kundu, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Folks, thank you so much for joining us today on Tennessee Valley This Morning. We're going to see you next Wednesday. Have yourself a great day. 63 degrees, Sunny skies today, so it should be a beautiful one.
Enjoy the beautiful weather.
Enjoy the beautiful weather, and don't forget tomorrow Nancy Kaysen will be your host. We'll see you next Wednesday on Tennessee Valley This Morning.